Well, good evening, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're here with another of our virtual events. And tonight we have Fiona Davis coming back, albeit virtually, to discuss her brand new book, The Magnolia Palace. And this is her 6th published book. We were just talking about that. And Fiona has signed a batch of books for us. Here we go. And I will go ahead and put a link in the comments field. We still have some, not too many left, but if you wish to purchase one, I'll put a link in the comments field. And also, if you have questions for Fiona, go ahead and put them in, and I'll be happy to ask them. Barbara usually summons me back towards the end of the hour. So Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Good evening, Fiona. It's lovely to see you.
Oh, so nice to see you. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyway, a toast to you.
Cheers. I wish it were vodka.
Well, I wish it were too, and one of these days we'll figure that out. But meantime, since we are having this wonderful trawl through New York cultural institutions, if I remember right, last book it was the New York Public Library, right?
Yes, exactly.
Lions of Fifth Avenue.
Yep.
Where else have you taken us in New York?
My goodness. Well, I started at the Barbizon Hotel for Women. That was the first book, The Dollhouse. And then we went to the Dakota on the Upper West Side, which was The Address. And then over to Grand Central Terminal, which was The Masterpiece. And then the Chelsea Hotel, which was Chelsea Girls. Lions of Fifth Avenue was the library. And now we are, as you said, we're at the Frick collection in the Magnolia Palace.
Right, which currently the Frick collection is not actually in the Magnolia Palace. It's been moved over to a brutalist style structure on Madison because the Frick, after considerable internal stress, is going through something of a remodeling renovation project, which is not surprising since it is a Gilded Age mansion. And increasingly, old buildings need, for modern access, need various improvements. But anyway, we're going to be talking about the Frick as it was rather than how it will be. It's on 70th and 5th. And Fiona, when is this supposed to reopen? Do you remember? Is it like a 2 or 3 year project?
It should be opening next year, so 2023. And what they're doing is they're expanding it. So right now the public area is just the first floor, and they're expanding it up to the 2nd floor. So there'll be more space. It's really, they're adding some education spaces. It's a really beautiful project that they're doing. And as you said, most of the artwork has been moved to the Frick Madison, which is actually a really interesting place to view the artwork and has gotten rave reviews in the Wall Street Journal and everywhere. So you can walk outside the Frick Mansion and you can go inside the Frick Madison and see the art.
Which I think is wonderful. There was, I think, some discussion about the garden because there is, territory, which is increasingly rare in New York, around the Frick. And one of the discussions, I think, was to do with the garden. So I like the fact they're going up rather than out.
Yes, you have to be so careful because it's this really beautiful, elegant building in Indiana limestone. It's gorgeous. And they wanted to protect, the facade and make sure it still looks, as you're approaching it, the way it did in 1914 when it was built. And I think they did a very good, subtle job of kind of moving around in the spaces that aren't as seen, as visualized from the street.
Well, when I was in New York last spring, I wanted to go to the Frick Madison, but I forgot. I'm just not used to this, that you have to actually buy tickets in advance because of all the COVID things. And it was only open on several days. Anyway, I couldn't work it out. So I'm hoping on my next trip, which probably will happen for Tollerfest in June, that I will plan ahead. I did plan ahead to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which may be on your list. But one of the things about the Gilded Age mansions that have survived in New York, which I think is really interesting, is they started much lower down on the island. And so the Morgan Library, which is a marvelous institution, is at 36th and Madison. It too has undergone some interesting renovation. But Frick kept moving uptown. So 70th is a long way north up the island from the Morgan. What other mansions do survive, and if we call them Gilded Age?
Well, it's funny because there's so many that didn't. There were all the Vanderbilt mansions, which were basically, one of them in particular looked like a French chateau had been plopped on Fifth Avenue, and that, of course, has has gone. And I know the Astor Mansion has gone. So there's not many left. The Carnegie Mansion is still up on the Upper East Side, and you can see that. But the Morgan Library is, yeah, it's beautiful. And that, of course, is the location for Marie Benedict's book, The Personal Librarian, which came out last year, right? I think it was last year.
Actually, we talked to Marie last Thursday, who said that she had given you a really nice quote for this book, and she liked it. And I would have said that, you know, maybe your next project should be the Morgan Library, except now that she's done a book about the Morgan and Belle Costa Green, who was a fascinating woman who was worked with J.P. Morgan to build his book collection. Possibly you'll go in some other direction, but one of the links between Henry Clay Frick and J.P. Morgan is when Morgan died, which he did, what was it, like 1912 or something?
Yeah,
Frick bought some of his, I don't think it was the books, I think it was the art. Did he buy the Fragonard from Morgan?
Yes, I believe he got the Fragonard and a number of ceramics, I think. I would have to check on that. But yeah, he bought a big chunk of the man's art collection. And the Fragonard panels are beautiful. They're in one room, and they were made for one of the mistresses of Louis XIV, something like that. And I have to check my dates. But they're beautiful. It's called The Progress of Love. Yes. And it's two young lovers cavorting, you know, it's just so beautiful and frothy and gorgeous. You feel like you could dive right into the paintings. And so that becomes a big part. It's a big scene in my book where, you know, you have this woman coming in to be interviewed as the private secretary to Henry's daughter, Helen. And that all happens in the Fragonard rooms. And that's really a test of her art acumen is that interview, which was really fun to write.
They are beautiful. You know, Fragonard and Bouffier both have this kind of, I don't know how to describe it exactly, very 18th century, very sort of Marie Antoinette style clothing most of the time, or definitely Louis XV anyway, if not Marie Antoinette. Probably is Louis XV, I think, primarily. And they're all sort of, you know, people disporting themselves in elegant court dress and pastoral settings, which is hilarious in and of itself. But I'm very fond of them. You know, they're sweet, and they make you feel good. What I do think is interesting is that you see it mostly at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but you definitely see it at the Cloisters, which is medieval. We're dropping way back further, is how things that were created to fit a particular building in space in France or otherwise in Europe can't really be destroyed. So the space in America that's going to display them has to be recreated to fit them.
Yes.
And, you know, did Frick, he must have had, Morgan brought them over. So Frick, did he actually build the room for the dimensions of the Fragonard, or did it just happen by coincidence that they worked?
I think the room, it may have been one thing first, and then he acquired the Fragonard and put them in. That's what my memory believes. But what's interesting about him is that he collected things like Turners and Renoirs and Rembrandt. And so, you know, you might have this old grizzled Rembrandt self-portrait on the wall next to a Renoir of, you know, little girls being walked in the park by their nanny. Or, you know, there are 34 Vermeers in the world, and 3 of them are at the Frick. And you study those, and you can get right up close and see what he did with the light. And it's just such a wonderful building because he built it for the art. He planned on leaving it out, you know, as a bequest to the public after he died. And so the whole building is really centered around the art, including an enormous art gallery that in a Gilded Age building at that time, it normally would have been the ballroom, but because he loved his art, it's the art gallery. And so you can really get a sense of what his tastes were like and what he was like. And that's what I tried to do in the book, is kind of bring these people who are long gone alive and place them in that building and just see what they do.
Which I think you did beautifully. Now, I have had the experience, thanks to a very dear friend who lives in Swickley, Pennsylvania, of spending time in the Frick in Pittsburgh. And the Frick in Pittsburgh is a Victorian house. It's completely different than the Frick in New York. I don't recall that it has a lot of art in it. I might be wrong there, but I remember, how Victorian it is and what a real contrast it is to the, as you say, gorgeous limestone, building on Fifth. But it also tells us a little bit about Henry Clay Frick, because I mean, he's a fascinating character. He's one of those, what we might call robber baron, or at least Gilded Age barons that emerged in the second half of the 19th century in the United States.
Yeah, he's a fascinating man. He was born in 1849, and he was born in Pennsylvania in coal country, and he made his first million by creating a company that produces coke, which is a fuel for steel, which of course was very much in demand at that point. And then he married a woman named Adelaide, and they moved to the Frick in Pittsburgh. And so that's why it's Victorian, because it was early on, it was in the 1800s that they lived there. And eventually, though, he decided to move to New York. And in 1914, they moved, and he acquired the property on East 70th Street. And he hired the company Carrere and Hastings, who were the architects who did the New York Public Library, to build this house for him. And he lived there with his wife and his adult daughter, Helen. They had a son too, who lived on Long Island. But what's interesting is later on in their lives, Helen really went back to the one in Pittsburgh. And that's where she ended her life, or she died. I think she was in her 90s when she died. She was quite, she lived a long time and led this really interesting life. But that was the transition. I think they wanted to kind of become part of New York society. And at that point, he stopped doing his business, and he was more about art collecting and socializing and that kind of thing. But, back in the day, he was a serious union buster. He survived an assassination attempt where an anarchist shot him, and they took the bullets out without anesthesia. This was not some, stuffy guy in a drawing room. He was tough. And you can tell that in his letters and his art. He was a really fascinating man, and a tough guy.
He was a tough guy. Absolutely true. Now, he didn't build in the Frick in Pittsburgh? It was an existing building he just moved into?
I don't know. I never got to go there because I was doing all this during COVID. So
Course.
I've never been able to go there yet. Although, people have said it's really, really beautiful. So I don't know if they had it built or not.
I wouldn't call it beautiful. I would call it interesting, because it's how, Victorian architecture is, you have to really get into it, to think it's beautiful.
Fussy.
It's so ornate and dark. It's fascinating, the use of light in the, as you say, the art gallery that would normally be a ballroom in the Frick in New York is such an incredible contrast to the light in the Victorian Frick in Pittsburgh. And also, the Victorian Frick in Pittsburgh is taller, because Victorian houses kind of went up, and smaller. And if I remember right, it's kind of on an incline. I think there might even be a car collection there. I may be not remembering right, but there's also, as often happens with homes, whether in England in the stately homes, because I have been to like every National Trust property in England, I think.
Oh, I know. Isn't it great?
Lord. Food service becomes a big thing. There's generally like a cafe or restaurant or something. So a big thing for people in Pittsburgh is to have tea at the Frick, or possibly lunch or dinner. I don't even remember what the restaurant hours, but most of the time they are daytime, because they have to have docents there to, keep track of stuff and all. So evenings are generally special parties or something.
Yeah.
When they bring in extra staff. So we have tea at the Frick, and they have like Christmas tea and all that good stuff, and it's really very nice. But honestly, the contrast between it and the Frick on Fifth Avenue is astonishing. And
I just want to say, what's interesting is that he went from Victorian to kind of neoclassical.
Yeah.
And there's these huge windows that let in so much light. And when he asks Thomas Hastings at the architecture firm to build it, he asked for something that was simple and conservative in every way. That was his specific quote to the architect. So he clearly was moving away from the fussiness of the Victorian era and wanting to create a monument to his art collection, and to himself, of course, that would last through time, which was really forward thinking of him.
It was forward thinking of him, but I think he was also smart enough to see that if the building overwhelmed the art, that would detract, in fact, from the gloriousness of his art. Also, he was able to buy this large property because, as I've earlier said, people were moving uptown, but up towards the upper reaches of Manhattan, but they hadn't all gone there. So probably he didn't have to pay as exorbitant a price for a big piece of land. It's about 11, 12 blocks from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it's on the east side of Fifth Avenue. And the Met, which has somewhat of a similar architecture, is on the left side. And then the Cooper Hewitt, isn't that, I think it's about 90th.
Yeah.
And it's another mansion that has survived, and where, what's his name? The Revlon guy.
Estee Lauder.
Yeah, thank you. Has put the Paul Klee collection, that particularly the woman, the very famous, what is it, Woman in Gold or whatever.
Yes.
But it's a small mansion, and you have to be able to go up and down stairs. But he has his Klees there.
Yeah, that's right across from the Met, that museum, very close to it.
It's close to it, but it's a little bit still up, isn't it? At 90th or 89th?
Yeah, it's different. It's the Noy Gallery.
The Noy Gallery, but it was originally, maybe I'm confusing it. I think the Cooper
Yeah,
Hewitt.
they're two different ones.
You're right. I'm sorry, I got confused. The Cooper Hewitt is American Decorative Arts and has some really interesting stuff in it. So I brought all this up because I love the way Fiona was taking us around New York landmarks. I got used to that with my very dear friend Linda Fairstein, who wrote many books, and each one of them related to a piece of New York history, not necessarily a landmark. And well, I won't even go into.
She did it beautifully. She did it
Fabulous.
beautifully. Building a mystery and a landmark. She did it first. Yep.
Yep, she did. And she went to the botanical gardens, and she even did one about, the little, the water. I mean, some of it was almost industrial, not just cultural. And, Marie Benedict has looked at interesting women who in the Morgan Library was the one that really affects New York. So do you see yourself continuing to look at New York cultural institutions in your novels? Or is that, you're 6 books in, or do you feel typecast and maybe you'd rather do something else?
Well, what's funny is I keep on thinking, we'll see what happens, but I finish one book and then something comes up and I think, oh, I'll go chase that. Like, after this book, after I was wrapping it up, I started looking into Carnegie Hall because when they built it, they included all of these artist studios on top. There were about 180 of them. And people who lived there, like Marlon Brando, Mark Twain passed by, Martha Graham. It's just this interesting little village on top of a building. And I ended up turning that into a short story that will be a part of Amazon, an anthology of historical fiction authors in the summer. So that became that book. And then I was thinking, all right, well, let's see what happens. And I got this email from a woman in her 80s I think she lives in Florida. And she said, look, if you ever want the secrets of Radio City, I was a Rockette and you should call me. And how could I say no, right?
Absolutely. Oh, wow. That would be really fabulous. I mean, there's that wonderful restaurant on the top, which I have eaten in several times. And
the Rainbow Room.
Thank you. I couldn't remember the name of it. The Rainbow Room and all of that. There's the Jewish Museum, which I think is really a fabulous museum. And it's in, I think, some kind of historic building, if I have it right.
Yeah, there's so many. It's in the Cloisters is a wonderful spot.
Oh, please. That actually, I have a fabulous story. Would you like to hear my story about the
Yes,
Cloisters?
I want to hear your Cloister story.
book?
First, explain what the Cloisters are so people know.
You go ahead.
Well, it's on the very north tip of Manhattan, and they moved basically a medieval chapel and monastery into the tip of Manhattan. And it's in this wooded area, so you kind of feel like you're going into Europe when you enter it. And it's beautifully preserved and really gorgeous.
It's actually part of a big park up there called Fort Tryon Park. If you take a boat tour, you can take one of the boat tours all the way around the island. It's really fun because when it starts coming down the west side, they go down towards the Statue of Liberty and all, and then they curve around Manhattan and go up way north, and then they come around. It's a great subway ride from Columbus Circle to 185th Street or something, I think it is. Then you get up there. And I'm bringing that up because I took I think she was then 8, granddaughter to New York when we still had an apartment at 57th and Park. And I thought, and it turned out we got there in a blizzard. And it took forever, forever to get there from JFK. And, she was somewhat traumatized by dinner at 11 o'clock and the whole bit. So the next day I said to her, let's go up and see the Cloisters. I think you'll really enjoy it. Now, why I thought an 8-year-old would like the Cloisters is a momentary lapse on my part. But actually, it was what I really thought was she'd like the subway ride. Because, she didn't know subways at all. It's a really long subway, right? So we go to Columbus Circle and we take the subway thing and you get out at Ford Tryon Park, take the elevator up, and you walk out and you're just blitzed by the snow. So we struggle along these, staggering through the snow and the whole bit till we get to the entrance of the Cloisters, which I'm trying to remember. I think it's Rockefeller that brought in, and it's a whole series. It's Romanesque, it's Gothic, it's a whole melange of
Right.
European medieval church, basically architecture, and it's wonderful. It goes up different levels, and fabulous gift shop, on and on and on. But the thing that's really famous at the Cloisters is the Unicorn Tapestry Room, and it's kind of in the center. And these are gorgeous medieval tapestries that are hanging there, and people go up to marvel at the Unicorn Tapestries. So anyway, questioning my wisdom about why we were there at all, we go into the Cloisters, and Mariah is really fascinated, and she kept going up to one thing after another, and she recognized the story. And I realized, this is so medieval because they did all this stuff because people didn't read, that she knew the stories from Sunday school, that this was actually art she could place in some context because these were, stories she learned in Sunday school, so she could recognize the players. And I was pretty fascinated with that. I thought, okay, we're here. It's meaningful to her, and all this is good. And then we end up in the Unicorn Room. I have been in the Unicorn Tapestry Room at least half a dozen times before then, sat on the bench, admired them a whole bit. And Mariah sits down with me, and she looks around, and she says to me finally, Grandma, she said, they're hanging in the wrong order.
Oh my goodness.
That's what I went.
You've got a little art historian there.
No, and I looked, and she's absolutely right that the sequence of the unicorn tapestries that tell the story of the unicorn hunt are hanging out of order, and they are hanging out of order because they had to fit the room, and they couldn't cut the tapestry, so they had to hang them in a sequence that blew the story in order to, and I thought, I have been here, my 8-year-old granddaughter has perceived the problem of the unicorn tapestries that her grandmother has totally missed.
I'm going to have to check that out next time I go.
Well, you really should, because once you look at it, you recognize that the story of the hunt, which is the whole point of the tapestries, is in fact wrong in the sequence. If you wrote a narrative structure that was that poor, you'd hear about it.
It's funny because writing about the Frick Museum, I knew I wanted to incorporate the art in some way into the story, but it's the same thing where I didn't want to have to hit people over the head of saying, well, here's a Renoir and it's really important and here's why. No one wants to read that. And so that's why I incorporated a scavenger hunt in the second half of the novel. It's two timelines. So in the modern timeline, it's about a couple who are trying to do this scavenger hunt and find these clues that are hidden within the art on the walls. And so each clue is something about, a piece of art that they have to then find and then find the next clue. And that was really fun to do because it's like a different angle on art history that for me made it come alive and made the people who painted the picture come alive, and even the portraits, who was that woman who was painted? What was her story, and how can I incorporate that into this one? And that was really fun. And I think coming at it from a different angle, like your granddaughter did, is, that's the way to do it, so that it's fun and not studying something.
I think you're right. I think, an unsophisticated viewer, you know, doesn't take anything for granted. It's all fresh, when you're 8, it's all fresh to you and you can see it. But anyway, I have been remiss. So when you say modern, you're actually in the 1960s. So why don't you tell us about the book? Because as your books often do, maybe they always do, I'm trying to remember back, you incorporate a past timeline and then a more current timeline, but not necessarily a contemporary one.
Yeah, exactly. So this one, it's in 1919, and like you said, 1966. And in 1919 is from the point of view of a very famous artist's model whose name is Lillian in the book. And she's stumbled upon really difficult times. She's in the midst of this terrible scandal. And she has to kind of find a way to hide out from the police. And she does it by taking the job of private secretary to Helen Frick, who was the very prickly and temperamental daughter of Henry Frick. And so she's living at the museum and pretending to be someone else and trying to be a private secretary, for which she has absolutely no skill. And she gets kind of caught up in the family drama, including romantic trysts and a stolen pink diamond, which I call the Magnolia Diamond in the book. And that's named after these magnolia trees that are really magnificent, that are outside in the lawn in front of the Frick. So that's one timeline. And then in 66, and it goes back and forth, it's from the point of view of a fashion model named Veronica. And she's doing a fashion shoot for Vogue in what's now the museum. It's no longer a house. And it just goes terribly wrong. And she gets stuck inside during a 3-day blizzard and locked inside this art museum, along with an intern named Joshua. And she discovers this series of hidden messages that send her and Joshua on this scavenger hunt, which ultimately she hopes will solve all of her financial problems and possibly reveal the truth behind a decades-old murder in the Frick family. And it's a mix of fact and fiction, real people I've made up. And I try to make it very clear in the author's note what is true and what is not, because I know especially historical fiction readers want to know.
That's certainly true. People who read historical fiction do want reliability from the author. But on the other hand, you do have to remember that it is fiction, so the author is allowed to make stuff up. And it is, do you think it's obligatory for the author to do an author note when you explain the differences?
I think it's helpful. For me, for the perfect example in the book is the character of Lillian, because people really are taken by her, by both her and Helen Frick. And Helen Frick was a real woman, so you can go and Google and find out all about her. But Lillian is inspired by this woman whose figure is carved above the doorway of the Frick. You can see it on the cover. So she's kind of right here. And I learned as I was kind of doing this tour of the place that the woman who posed for that was actually named Audrey Munson. And she was a very celebrated artist model who was known for her perfect beauty. She can be found on statues all over Manhattan today, at the Brooklyn Museum, New York Public Library. She's in that fountain. She rises out of the fountain in front of the Plaza Hotel. She's at Columbus Circle. She's everywhere. And what happened was she was caught up in this terrible scandal, which is very similar to the one in the book that I describe. But unfortunately, her story differs from Lillian's in the book, where she and her mother fled upstate. She tried to commit suicide by drinking mercury. And eventually her mother put her in an asylum, where she died in 1996 at the age of 104.
Oh
and
my
at
God.
that time, she was buried in an unmarked grave. And I just thought, here's this woman who's been completely lost to history. And everyone knows the sculptors' names, but no one knows this woman's name, whose face is found all over Manhattan. And that made me want to create a character inspired by her. But because I do a different ending to her life, so I haven't given anything away, I renamed her and then explain in the author's note that if you want to learn more about this fascinating character that my character is inspired by, here's her name, here's this book that was really helpful. It was called Curse of Beauty. That's all about her life and has all these great photos. And so if you want to go down that rabbit hole just the way I did when I was writing it, you can.
So I think it's important to say that the scandal was not her fault.
No.
And, and it reminds you of just how difficult it was. even then, when people got doxxed, so to speak, to, to fight that. Can you give us the background for your fictional character, Scandal? Because it comes right up at the very beginning of the book, so it's not giving anything away.
Yeah, it opens it. So in real life and in the book, her landlord killed his wife very brutally. And the police, when they were doing, the detective work, they discovered a black and white photo of Lillian/Audrey in a bathing suit from an ad that she'd done. And they decided it must be a love triangle. And they really started going after her. And so, she'd been so celebrated and been doing really well. And then everything just got completely messed up. And she started having, it sounds like, mental health issues at that point, and things got pretty ugly for her quickly. But yeah, it was this kind of crazy scandal about the landlord going crazy and killing his wife. It was shocking.
Yeah, I mean, it was the wrong place at the wrong moment.
Mhm.
And it's terrible when we were watching the Beatles thing, the 8.5 hours of Let It Be or something, and trying to realize, that the nut job that shot John Lennon and killed him. I mean, the whole thing was completely ridiculous. And how sad it is that tragedy is visited on people out of the blue, so to speak, and for no particular fault of their own. But and also people who are famous or celebrated are far more likely to be the unwittingly caught up in things like that. We see it today all the time.
Yeah, and in the book, I think the two characters, Veronica in the 60s and Lillian in the 1919s, they're used to being looked at because they're both models, and they're both seen for their beauty. And I'm really looking in the book about what's the difference between being looked at and being seen. And how do they become fully three-dimensional women when most people want is just one dimension? And so that's one of the things I try to kind of delve into in the book and show how things have changed over time, and also how they haven't.
Well, let's go back to the Lions of Fifth Avenue. You had a woman there who, I love the fact that you pointed out that there was, like, I don't know if I can't even remember when we talked about it, whether true or not, there were living quarters within the library for the librarian. But, the wife wanted to be seen in her own right, and not just as, the woman keeping house inside the New York Public Library. And especially if you go back in time away, but it's even true today, women like that often end up in terrible situations because people don't want them, to do that. They resent them being seen. They want to pull them back or tarnish it, or they just become cliques. The media today seems totally unable to resist anything that will get them clicks.
Oh, I know. It's really
they're so much
horrifying.
responsible for what has gone wrong since the 2016 election. They just can't turn away, from all this nonsense and cliques that they just ignored Trump. Sorry, I'm going to be political there for a moment. Why do they even have to report that he thinks he might pardon, the January 6th rioters or something? I mean, how is that even worth? But it's a click, right? It will get people excited. I think the media has become so irresponsible, but apparently, judging from your story here, that was true then.
Oh, goodness. It was even crazier. Pulitzer was a complete, the papers were all about whatever you could make up to make people buy the paper. It was in the early 1900s, newspapers could not be trusted at all. It was just crazy. It was called yellow journalism. Yep. And today, I think there are news outlets that are careful. And if they make a mistake, they acknowledge it. It's the news outlets that just want the clicks and will say anything and allow people to say anything in order to, keep their viewership, who are being really irresponsible. There are some great journalists out there doing some amazing work. Yeah. And thank goodness for them, because that's the only way democracy is going to last, I think.
Well, I think it's fascinating. I was reading, the Spotify guy trying to, justify his, and, it seemed to me this is a real digression, but it seems to me that it's only really financial pressure that is going to have any effect. There's no point in appealing to anybody's moral compass or whatever it all is. But if enough people leave Spotify that it becomes so expensive to keep Joe Rogan as opposed to losing him, they'll
Right.
kick him loose, But I mean, it's difficult to have much respect for any of these people who use the First Amendment to kind of justify, what really is just an economic thing. But we have a tendency to think, the only reason I'm mentioning all this, we have a tendency to think that this is only a contemporary problem. But in fact, it goes back, centuries. I mean, there used to be broadsheets, for example, if you read English history, broadsheets would, come out where somebody would just do like a single sheet with some kind of a scandal, and then all the newsboys would rush out across London or whatever, with this single scandal mongering thing and all. So it's gone on forever, hasn't it? And it's really all about money.
It's so interesting because I just finished reading a galley of a book that's a nonfiction account of the Heterodoxy Club, which is a club that I talk about in the Lions of Fifth Avenue, which was a Greenwich Village women's club where women could debate the issues of the day. And the woman who wrote it, Joanna Scutts is her name, and it's coming out sometime this year. She takes the individual members of the club and really examines what was going on at that time in terms of women's issues and, workplace issues and sexism and suffrage and immigration. And you realize as you're reading it that we're just going through cycles,
Yeah.
it was like this back then. And we just seem to forget and repeat ourselves. It's a wonderful book. It's called Hotbed, and I highly recommend people keep an eye out for it.
That's a really great idea. I thought that I'm an historian by training, and I thought that I knew quite a lot about the Second World War, and I was really completely ashamed to read a review in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago that pointed out the United States did not declare war on Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany declared war on the United States. I just thought, well, after Pearl Harbor, we went for both of them. Not true. And a guy has written a whole book about that was Hitler's costliest error, not going to Russia, which I personally think was his cost, or up till then thought it was his most serious mistake. And he obviously never bothered to read about Napoleon. But,
Yeah.
And I mean, I thought to myself, how did I never think about that? How did I never really realize that, Hitler on December 12th declared war on the United States. And that was the final thing that pulled us into the war in Europe.
Wow, no, I didn't know that. There you go.
Well, I mean, seriously, I'm just astounded that somebody has just written a book to the effect that Neville Chamberlain's trip to Munich undid a serious and likely to succeed effort to actually get rid of Hitler. But he undermined there was this whole alliance of people that had come together, and he went and it just totally blew it by, appeasing Hitler. And I always thought Chamberlain was an idiot, but it didn't occur to me that he'd actually torpedoed what could have been a perfectly legitimate effort. Well, I say legitimate, a perfectly likely effort to get rid of Hitler before the whole thing started. And, you realize, Fiona, the history really does turn on the actions occasionally of just a single person.
Yeah, peace is so fragile. I think peace and democracy are so fragile. Anything can send them both off.
They
off
are.
kilter.
If you're an historian, you debate the great man theory of history. Does history really largely the effect of single individuals making, decisions and doing things? And while in many ways you can argue against it, in many ways you have to look back and you think, okay, William the Conqueror determined to conquer England, Henry VIII determined to divorce his wife and marry Anne Boleyn, so let's get rid of the Catholic Church. Or, and I think it's a combination of individuals and historical forces coming together. But in a lot of ways, it really is cyclical, isn't it? And we're back in the 1930s at the moment.
Yeah, we're banning books and all kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, how are we going to come out of this? And I find it, as an historian, fascinating. Part of me wants to live long enough to see how it turns out. Part of me is happy that I'm 81 and I probably won't have to pay the consequences of so much of this. Um,
Oh,
Amazing.
oh.
But when you apply a novel assign to historical events, you then get to interpret things in a way that an historian is really not at liberty to do. Is that why you choose to write fiction about all of this rather than to write, nonfiction?
Oh yeah, I think writing nonfiction is just, having gone to Columbia Journalism School and know authors who write books that are about factual things, it's just so much work. It's incredible. And for me, I love reading historical fiction, and I love feeling like I've been stepping back in time through characters who are doing things that, are exciting. And I love tension in a story, which of course you find in real life as well. But there's just something about historical fiction that feeds my soul. And so I've loved writing about it. And especially doing dual timelines, when you can really compare and contrast what's happened over time, how the city, how the building, how its residents have changed over time or not.
I think fiction can sometimes do a fairer or more interpretive portrait of people and events than I talked to Marie Benedict about this last week. Real biography has to stick to the facts, and fictional looks at lives can use a novelist's imagination to interpret things that I often think might get more closely to the truth of it than just, reciting the facts. So I really have.
Yeah, I think anything that makes you kind of throw yourself into the story and get lost in it and then want to know more, that's great, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. That's the key.
I think your books are remarkable. I really enjoyed all of them. Before we call Patrick back, you are clearly at work on a new one. We sort of touched on that, but so maybe 18 months or whatever, 2 years hence, we're not going to be looking at Carnegie Hall. We're going to be looking at what?
At Radio City.
At Radio City. Oh,
Yeah.
in the Rainbow Room. I love it.
Yeah.
Are you going to go outside and talk about, the skating rink and the statue and the whole bit?
Yeah. I'm kind of working in various locations. There's so much to play with there. And on top of that, it's set in the 50s, and there was a boarding house for actors and dancers, all women, called the Rehearsal Club. And so part of the book is set there, which is really fun as well, to try and recapture what that must have been like.
Oh, well, I can't wait to read that one. That sounds wonderful. Patrick, why don't we call you back and see if we have questions from our audience?
Sure thing. Let's see. Well, we've had a couple people right off the bat mention how much they enjoyed reading your author's notes at the back of this book. Did you have a good time putting that together?
I did. I was slightly terrified because, you want to make sure you're very clear. And how am I clear about that there's three main characters? One is completely fictional, one is fictionalized, and one is inspired by. And how do I make that really, really clear, as well as definitely pay tribute to the books and the people I talked to who were so instrumental in filling out the gaps of the story. So yeah, it was really fun, but it took me a while, and I really revised that like crazy, more than probably any other chapter in the book, actually.
Let's see here. Well, somebody just looked up on Google, says, if Google is correct, the US declared war on Japan 12/8/41, then on Germany 12/11/41.
I'll leave that to you, Barbara.
I think
That's
Google
yours.
may not be correct, because there really is, Hitler, as it turned out, did declare war on the United States, not the other way around. We responded.
Yeah.
And that's the part. I mean, obviously it's a two-way street. They declare war on you, you declare war back. And I think that's the part that hasn't been brought to light very clearly. And so I think there may be some revisions going on there.
Let's see here. Okay, yeah. Jane Ann would like to know, she says, speaking of journalists, you were talking about that earlier. Can Fiona please tell about her transition from journalism to authoring historical novels?
Sure, that's a great question. So I went to Columbia and I got a master's in journalism, and I did freelance journalism, writing about health and fitness and the arts for about a little over 10 years. And then I just stumbled into this story at the Barbizon condo, which had been the Barbizon Hotel for Women. And I just started thinking what a great article that would be about these older women who, when it went condo, were moved into the fourth floor into rent controlled apartments because they'd lived there for years and they were grandfathered in. And then they built, these luxury condos around them, including a guy in the $17 million penthouse. And meanwhile, they're paying, $250 a month. And I was just so curious what that dynamic was like. But it was a very hard story to get interviews for at that time. And I just couldn't shake it. And I started thinking, well, maybe, I'll write a book that's a fictional account of it. And I'll make it 2 timelines because that'll be fun. And that's what I like to read. And then I'll make one a journalist who starts getting nosy into the disappearance of her older neighbor, and just went down that road and read everything I could on how to write a book and studied other dual timeline books to see how other people did it. And it took a while, but that eventually became my debut, The Dollhouse.
Have you ever looked at the Colony Club?
I have. I love that story. That's a really, really good one and very, female centric. I think that would be great.
It might be one that you'd enjoy writing. We had a friend that we met years ago on a cruise who was in charge of programming for the Colony Club. She had belonged to it for many, many years. It was the first time I knew anything about it. And I would think that would be something that would really be of interest to you.
And there's some great personalities who've passed through those doors, definitely.
Let's see here. Yeah, there are a couple of viewers who are talking about how beautiful the cover is of this new book. Sherry says the book cover for the masterpiece, which is also the actual dress worn by Clara, is positively brilliant. It's so exciting when we come to the part in the novel where the cover of your book becomes more than just a beautiful dust jacket. Can you talk a little bit about that? And I'm sure you have quite a bit of input into it.
Yeah, the covers are always the scariest part because you want something, that fits the building and the story. And Dutton, the art director, is Christopher Lynn, and he does a wonderful, wonderful job. And, you usually with historical fiction have that black and white photo and then the figure in front. And the fact that he kind of wrapped it with those magnolias just, I thought, made it really fresh and modern, right? Yeah. And so it was kind of a collaboration. I supplied the image of the building and then they placed the woman on it. And it was great right from the start. It wasn't like there was a lot of back and forth. The colors were great. Yeah, I just, it's so rich. And I've had so many readers reach out to me and say, I don't read historical fiction, but I bought this because of the cover. And that's a true testament to art design. That I have nothing to do with that. That is art design and the way, their minds work, that they can create something so stunning.
It is a beautiful cover.
I was going to say, there are a few viewers who have made reference to a map of your city. Has that appeared on your website, or where can they find that?
Yeah, that is in the book club kit. There's a couple maps going on right now. One is in the book club kit, which can be found on the Magnolia Palace page on my website. And they have, book club questions along with a map of all of many of the locations where Audrey Munson statues are located in New York City, which is really, really fun. And the art department put that together. And so you can kind of see her likenesses and where they are. There's another map going on this week that Apple Maps put together, it's a hyper-local guide that they asked me to put together for Manhattan, which has all of the locations of all the buildings, as well as the secret bar in Grand Central that I love, and the downtown jazz club that the one in the Dollhouse is modeled after. And you can find that if you go to Apple Maps and search and put in my name, you can see. And that way, if you ever come to New York, you can, to give yourself a self-guided tour of all the locations. It's just a wonderful opportunity, and they did a great job of it.
New York City.
I love that you can, because of websites and so forth, we can be interactive in ways that you can relate to the book. One of the other things I really loved about the book is that if you go to the Frick today, well, when you can go back to the Frick next year, it's a museum. And when Fiona writes about it, it's a family home. There are people who live there. And even though it was Henry Frick's intention to turn it into a place for his art and so forth, for the public to view, It was still a family home while he was alive. Did Helen go back to Pittsburgh because she didn't want to live in a museum? Why did she return to the frick in Pittsburgh?
Yeah, what happened? First of all, one thing I love about the fact that it was a house was it was a family of 3 served by a staff of 27. You know, it's
Right.
quite the ratio there. And what happened was after he died in 1919, Helen and her mother stayed on until her mother died in 1931. And at that point, it was turned over and became a museum. And Helen moved upstate in Westchester and bought a farm. And she was based there. And later she went back to Pittsburgh. But for most of the time, she was at her farm. And as she was doing that, she was really pursuing her passion. And that was creating the Frick Art Reference Library, which is next door to the Frick and one of the top art reference libraries in the world today. She really was quite a powerhouse there.
What happened to her brother?
Childs, he married and had kids and lived on Long Island and eventually passed away. But
So
yeah,
he wasn't really involved with the house.
No, not really. He was off doing his own thing. He loved fossils. He didn't like art, and so it was almost like Helen and her dad teamed up and became partners, especially because the mom, Adelaide, really retreated from view after a tragedy when Helen was young. And so it was really Helen and her dad who were forging this partnership and their love of art, and they fought and they, made up, and it was quite a volatile relationship because they're both very tough, hard-headed people. And that was really fun to capture in the book.
It's interesting because in Marie Benedict's book, the personal library, is that what it's called?
Personal librarian, yeah.
About J.P. Morgan, his son actually did a great job working with Belda Costa Green and so forth when J.P. Morgan died, and it all survived in large effort because his son stepped up and took things over. But oftentimes in rich families like that, it doesn't work out that way.
Right. And I just want to mention that she co-wrote it with Victoria Christopher Murray, personal librarian. Just want to give a shout out to both authors.
She did, indeed.
Mm-hmm.
You talked in the author's notes about, kind of all the ingredients that go into creating one of these novels. Does it always for you start with a place, a specific location? Is that the first starting point?
Yeah, for almost all the books except for one, I've looked into the place and started doing research and just founding things that surprised me, like the fact that the super and his family lived in an apartment in the library, or the fact that Helen Frick was this great woman of contradictions, or Audrey Munson posed for the pediment above the door and led this wild life. So I'm looking for that kind of thing that really sparks my interest. The one book that didn't was the Chelsea Girls. And with that, I met a woman in her 90s who'd been a Broadway actress during the McCarthy era. And her life was really, really fascinating. And I knew I wanted to create a story around her life and what was going on in the theater world during the Red Scare in the 1950s. And so that's where that came from. And then the Chelsea Hotel fit that story. So that was the only one I retrofit.
I have a question from who I think is a writer. She says, "Hi, Fiona, love the book. How do you write dual timelines without there being a disconnect between the two?" She says, "I'm struggling with this."
Oh, I understand. It's so painful. If I'd known how hard they are, I would have never embarked on writing dual timeline. But what I do is I do all the research and start getting the ideas for the 2 timelines. And then the characters start coming to me. And at a certain point, I know it's time to work out the plot, but I really figure out who the characters are first. Mm-hmm. And I try to make them different in each timeline. So they have different strengths and different weaknesses. And then as you create their stories, you can, it will naturally compare and contrast, and you won't have to kind of consciously do it. You want to just create these characters and let them go off and do what they do. And I do outline before I start writing. So I know what chapter is going to say what, and I know what timeline it's going to be pretty much. And I know how the story is going to unfold. And that's the only way I can do it. I can't just sit down and see what happens on the page. I have to have an outline to go with. And that tends to help a little.
What about, there are a couple of questions about your historical research, and how do you get like the mundane, everyday details right? Do you look at period publications and newspapers and, what does it cost to buy a pack of cigarettes in 1920 or 1919? Do those things help you?
Yeah, oh, that's a great question. It's finding things like in the Frick's digital archives, they would have dinner party menus from the huge dinner parties that they held from 1915. So I could see what they ate.
Right.
Or, they had the payroll. So I could see who all the staff were, what their names were, how much they were paid and what they did, and kind of form the story from that. And yeah, it's Googling things about, or I remember, she becomes the private secretary to Helen Frick, Lillian does. And so I found a book from, I think, 1905 of how to be a private secretary. And, and you're not talking about, computers or that kind of thing. You're talking about typewriters and how to open a letter and that kind of thing. And that just gives it a little bit of detail. So, and you have to remember they were real people. So, you don't want to get too lost in what color dress they wore, what the shoe was like. You want to find the ones that really sing and hit those details hard.
And the way they speak, I'm sure, is very important. Getting that the rhythm and the cadences of the day vaguely accurate if you can, right?
Definitely. And I'm really lucky there in that both my parents are English. And so my mother especially just speaks in a way that's not American. So if I can tap into her voice, I can create a character in the early 1900s in America because it feels just slightly formal.
It was more formal. I was going to say, that I think that's one thing that you have to remember is that being a private secretary, you really had to learn some formalities and rituals and so forth that today would not necessarily apply. Today, you probably have to be IT literate or something. But, there were very careful modes of address and, conventions to be observed. So you had to learn all that if you wanted to be a private secretary.
Yeah, there were rules. That's right.
For sure.
There's a question about what inspired the 60s timeline.
Yeah, that one, one reason was that I hadn't worked in that decade before in my books. That was the one that was left, I think. And so I wanted to try and play around with that. And I liked the fact that, as I was writing it in 2020, America was in a lot of turmoil, especially in terms of racial equality. And that was going on in the 60s as well. Yeah. And then I gave myself this kind of tighter constrictions on that timeline where it's a limited number of people, a limited setting, and a limited timeline. So it's only 2 people at the Frick for 3 days. And just to see what I could do with that in terms of these 2 characters who are strangers, what happens over the course of 96 hours when they're trapped inside the Frick.
Ticking clock never hurts to move a story along. It is a definite driver for suspense. Is there anything else, Patrick?
Yeah, I mean, you may have just partially answered this one. Jane Ann says, what is Fiona's favorite part of Magnolia Palace? And what was the most difficult part to write?
Oh, what a good question. I think my favorite scene to write was the scene where Helen and Lillian meet and where she gets interviewed for the job, because I think both their personalities really come out there. The hardest scene to write, that's a really good one. Probably it's the kind of the scenes where Joshua and Veronica in the 60s are getting to know each other, because I didn't want them to be repetitive. You need to keep on upping the game as they get more and closer to each other. And so those were tough to make sure that the story was moving forward and it wasn't getting stuck.
Oh, here's a great question that just came in. Karen says, I loved the book, loved the Frick Museum. It led me to study Frick himself. And let's see, did you feel that you had to hold back from betraying the popular feeling of dislike, even hatred for this man?
No, I felt like, I don't think he comes across as all that sympathetic in the book. And I tried to explore why and be very open about what he did in his past that made him, there's a reason why someone tried to shoot him. And so, but for me, both he and Helen are three-dimensional characters, and they have vulnerabilities and weaknesses and strengths. And so by showing them from the outsider's point of view, which is Lillian, you can maybe get a sense of who they were, inside and out, hopefully, without forgiving them for any of the nonsense that they pulled.
I think you're right that it's really important that you have an observer talk, interpreting them rather than them making their own case. I would like to, before we conclude, read, there are a whole bunch of fabulous reviews for this book. Fiona has been feted all over for her accomplishments here, but I really like this one. Davis knows exactly how to structure a story whose characters are richly drawn. The Magnolia Palace pays particular attention to those who might go unnoticed. The deaf private secretary, the museum intern, the organ player. We discover their private lives and public exposures, which reveal the daily messiness of human lives, the construction of the self, and the truths we all find so hard to hide. I thought that was a wonderful comment. And indeed, it's important that, it's not just these main characters we've been talking about, but it's these other people who populate the book that really bring it to life in a very special way, Fiona. So I think you've done really a fabulous job. Do you feel like this is the best book you've written? I hate to say best. Is this the book that you think has worked the best? Maybe I should say that has done better in conveying what you wanted to achieve than any of the others, or can you not choose between your children?
Yeah, no, I think with each book I've learned something and then been able to apply it to the next book. It's interesting, this book is the one that seems to be really taking off because, my other locations are pretty well known, but not many people outside of New York know the Frick. And so it's just a wonderful irony that this is the book that's getting so much attention. And yeah, that review just made my day when I read that, because it was like, oh, this reviewer really gets it. It was in Book Trib, and I'm so grateful for it. That meant so much.
It's an excellent review. And it is interesting because you think that the New York Public Library would have been, the one that most people recognized. I'm myself passionate about the Frick, and that's why I asked if we didn't have another author involved. So it would just be you and me talking about the Frick, but
yeah,
amazing. Right. So Patrick, anybody else?
Are there any other cities that would compel you to write about them? A place in Los Angeles, for instance, or any other places?
It's funny, I've lived in New York for about 35 years, so that's definitely home. But I would love to London would be really fun to set something there. I love that kind of crumbling English manor house story. But yeah, and there's so many great writers writing regional theater, regional books around America. I would hate to swoop into Chicago and steal someone else's story or something, but there are so many great locations around. And everywhere I go when I travel, people tell me, "Oh, you got to hear about this hotel, or you've got to hear about this place." Is
there a London?
You may inspire other authors to write sort of. For a long time in mystery fiction, there have been authors who focused on a particular state. So Archer Mayer owns Vermont. Michael McGarty for a long time owned New Mexico, while Stephen Havel owned the boot heel of New Mexico. C.J. Box, Wyoming, right?
Louise Penny, Montreal,
Stabenow, Alaska, and so this is a more compressed version, instead of like a whole state, you can take a city like New York and do that. And I'm hoping that you may inspire Margaret Maron. I shouldn't leave her out. North Carolina, I mean, she was magnificent. Or, there are people who write Carl Hyacin on Florida, for example, or John Sanford on Minneapolis, although now that Lucas is a U.S. Marshal, he's not Twin City, Minnesota, located. But I hope you might give inspiration to authors to look at a smaller, what do I want to call it, circumference or something, and think about icons within those more restricted areas. So I was thinking years ago, we were in Vancouver after we took a trip through the British Columbia on the Rocky Mountaineer. And to my surprise, when we're sitting down in a restaurant in Vancouver, there was a big thing on the menu that said, this is where locavore cuisine really comes into its own. Everything in this restaurant everything on the menu is grown locally. All the wines are sourced locally. It's the locavore thing. And I thought, okay, but then I thought, why can't we do that with fiction?
Oh, I like that. Yeah. Yeah, that's it.
Locavore fiction, so to
Mhm.
speak.
Yeah.
Which really makes a lot of sense, because I think particularly now when we can't travel and we can't do as many things as we used to, maybe that's partly why this is striking a chord.
Mm.
People can't necessarily or want to go to New York at the moment, but this is their opportunity to have a more intimate view of New York than than they would get.
That
So,
could definitely be. Yeah.
It's so interesting how, in New York, but in most cities, the ghosts of the past are never too far away. You see them, they're coming up through the street grate. They're a couple of years ago, or a number of years ago, when they were, I can't remember what it was. It was down in the Five Points area of New York City, down in the Bowery, that part of town. They were removing a building, and they found all this stuff from, gangs of New York era signs and things
wow.
like that. I remember reading a story about that. And you get that feeling. I get it in Los Angeles, but New York, the ghosts of the past, they're always close by. Do you feel
or
that?
Boston, think
Boston,
about Dennis Lehane, who's done such a wonderful job with Boston, and they're, Dashiell Hammett in San Francisco and so forth. But
Yep.
I'm really hoping that Fiona's work will be inspirational to authors, because I think it's just a wonderful way to combine a love of fiction and a love of mystery and a love of adventure and, character and all the rest of it with a love of place.
Thank you. Yeah. And then, you know what, if you love the Ghosts of New York, I highly recommend checking out the Ephemeral New York newsletter.
Oh,
You get something that's about old New York every, 3 things a week. Ephemeral New York. And it really is. It's like seeing the ghosts of the past whenever that comes into my inbox. It's very inspirational.
Are there any New York historical novels that have really inspired you?
Oh, there's so many. Yeah. Like The Alienist, of course, is one. Oh gosh, there's so many, and I love reading them for research too, because you can really get a sense of old New York. And of course, I'm blanking right now completely on many of them.
I remember reading The Winter's Tale.
Lindsay Fay wrote a few back. I can't even remember what the names of them were, Patrick, but remember she wrote 3 or 4. I think they were in the 1840s about New York. Lots of people have written things about Poe, which necessarily, wind up being about when, when Midtown was farm country, which is. And then, who is it? Andrew Taylor has written some really good books about pre-revolutionary New York, for example. And I'm trying to remember. There's a wonderful author who's written several books that are, I'll have to think, it's hard to remember all this, and I've had too much wine. So at this moment, I probably should go and eat dinner. So
all right, go feed yourself.
Here we go.
But it's been wonderful, Fiona, to visit with you. I'm hoping that by the time you write your next book, which we now know will be Radio City, that you can actually come to Scottsdale and we can talk about it. But in the meantime, we highly recommend the Magnolia Palace. It is our February historical fiction book of the month. And it sold super well, but Fiona was kind enough to sign a bunch of copies for us. So we still have some. And if you're going to buy a book, you might as well buy an autographed book. Why not? Right?
Yes, and support your local indie bookstore. And thank you so much, Barbara and Patrick. This has just been such a lovely conversation. And yes, I'll be there in person within minutes. Just say the word.
Well, I hope we can do it. Anyway, I want to thank all of you for watching. Jane Ann, thank you for, I know who you are. Thank you very much for tuning in, and as always, asking your perspicacious questions, which are much appreciated. Patrick, did you have anything else you wanted to say?
Just congratulations, Fiona.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
You bet.
Good night, everybody. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
I'll send you the link for the podcast tomorrow, okay?
Perfect. Right. Thanks so much.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.